July 11th, 1302. An open field near Courtrai, in Flanders. The French cavalry, the most feared military force in all of Europe, advanced in close formation against a line of Flemish peasants, men mounted on war horses, protected by gleaming armor, carrying lances that shone under the morning sun. On the other side, farmers and craftsmen wielding farming tools turned into weapons. A slaughter foretold. But the peasants knew something the French didn't. Something hidden beneath their feet. Something that would turn that day into the nightmare of the French nobility and forever change the course of medieval warfare. This is the story of the Battle of the Golden Spurs. A battle that should never have happened. A victory that looked impossible. And a moment that proves even the most powerful can crumble when they underestimate those fighting for their home. To understand what happened that day, we need to understand who the French were, and why absolutely no one, not a single person in all of Europe, thought they could be beaten. The French cavalry was medieval Europe's military elite. Knights trained since childhood in mounted warfare. Men born into nobility, raised for combat, equipped with the finest armor money could buy. Every French knight represented decades of intensive training, a king's ransom in equipment, and centuries of unbroken victories. When French cavalry rode to war, kingdoms genuinely feared them. And this wasn't just talk. Medieval heavy cavalry was genuinely devastating. Picture hundreds of war horses, each weighing over 1,000 pounds, thundering forward in locked formation at full gallop. The earth itself shook, lances leveled, armor gleaming, banners snapping in the wind. The sight alone was enough to shatter the courage of entire armies before the fighting even started. Regular foot soldiers ran. Shield walls burst apart on impact. A French cavalry charge wasn't a military tactic. It was an act of nature, like watching an avalanche roll down a mountainside. Against this war machine, the Flemish fielded something that seemed like a bad joke. Peasant militias, men who worked their fields 6 days a week and practiced with whatever weapons they could make. Weavers swinging godendags, wooden clubs bristling with metal spikes, blacksmiths hefting warhammers, farmers with sharpened pitchforks, merchants carrying swords they'd never used in real fighting. These were Flanders defenders. The difference wasn't just weapons, it was class. In 1302, war was a nobleman's business. Knights fought knights, bound by codes of chivalry. Peasants weren't real soldiers, they were targets, property. Nobles captured by nobles were ransomed. Peasants captured by nobles were executed. The very thought of commoners challenging knights in pitched battle was seen as an offense against nature itself. Military heresy. But the Flemish had something the French lacked. Desperation. Real motivation. This wasn't a war of conquest for them, it was survival. France had occupied Flanders since King Philip IV decided he wanted control of their wealthy cloth trade. The Flemish tried negotiation. They tried political pressure. Nothing worked. By July 1302, after months of French brutality, after their leaders were imprisoned, after their independence was publicly crushed, the Flemish peasants made an unthinkable choice: face French cavalry in open battle. And they had one advantage no invading force could match. They knew the land, every hill, every stream, every swamp. They'd been born here, worked here, lived here their whole lives. While the French prepared for what they saw as a routine cleanup operation, the Flemish leaders were doing something else, something quiet, something the French spies never reported. They were booby-trapping the field. The battlefield the Flemish chose looked like the worst possible place to defend against cavalry. A flat stretch of land between the River Lys and Courtrai, open terrain, perfect for cavalry charges. Exactly what any French commander prayed for when facing disorganized foot soldiers. But there was a secret, something hidden, something the Flemish had spent weeks creating. Hidden ditches, not massive trenches that would be obvious, but small, carefully placed pits covered in vegetation and branches. Marshy sections they'd widened and camouflaged, stakes planted in kill zones. The Flemish weren't just choosing their battleground, they were weaponizing it, turning an open field into a minefield for charging horses. But the French had no idea. To French commanders, this was routine, a chance to smash peasant rebels and restore control. Count Robert II of Artois, commanding the French forces, dismissed the Flemish militia as an annoyance, not a real threat. His knights had beaten professional armies. What could farmers do against Europe's best cavalry? July 11th morning came. The two armies faced off. French side, approximately 500 mounted knights, heavily armed, convinced of their superiority. Flemish side, roughly 9,000 soldiers, many with minimal armor, packed into a tight defensive formation. By any standard military logic, this was a slaughter waiting to happen. French cavalry would roll through the Flemish line, scatter them, and cut down the runners. But the Flemish held ground, packed tight, weapons raised, waiting for the cavalry charge they knew was coming. No escape plan, no retreat strategy. This was fight or die. Every man understood. If they ran, the cavalry would hunt them down like prey. If they broke formation, they were finished. Standing together was their only chance, standing like a wall of flesh and desperation. The French saw this stubbornness as stupidity, men too dumb to know they were beaten. Count Artois gave the order, charge. Lances dropped. Horses shifted from trot to gallop. The valley filled with thunder. Thousands of tons of horseflesh and steel racing toward the Flemish line. The sight that had shattered armies, the force that couldn't be stopped. The peasants watched them come, felt the earth shake, heard the roar of armored men shouting. Some were terrified, absolutely terrified. But they didn't run, didn't break, waited, because they knew something the French had missed, something hidden in the ground ahead, something prepared for weeks, inch by inch, pit by pit, stake by stake. The cavalry thundered across the field, lances forward, knights braced for impact. The Flemish leaders watched, counting distance, waiting for the moment when the land, the speed, and physics would turn against the French. The cavalry was about to find out what weeks of hidden work had accomplished. They were about to learn that terrain knowledge plus desperation plus careful preparation can turn farmers into killers. They were about to experience the shock that would rewrite European military thinking forever. The charge rolled forward. The ground shook. The trap waited, seconds away. And then, impact. The front line hit the hidden ditches. Not a stumble, a catastrophe. War horses at full gallop, each carrying a fully armored knight, plunged into ground that vanished beneath them. Front legs sank into 5-foot pits they never saw. Physics took over. Horses flipped forward with tremendous force, hurling armored knights like ragdolls. The impact was brutal, and the cavalry couldn't stop. The rear ranks couldn't see what happened in front. Dust clouds blocked their view. They kept charging straight into the chaos. Horses crashed into fallen horses. Knights were crushed by their own mounts. The perfect formation transformed into a twisted tangle of steel, bodies, and panic. The momentum had completely shifted. The trap the Flemish peasants had prepared for weeks finally activated, and it worked beyond all expectation. Let me break down exactly how this worked, because the brilliance wasn't just the ditches themselves, it was turning the entire landscape into a weapon. The Flemish started preparations weeks out. They knew this land inside and out. Every hill, every swamp, every spot where infantry could move but charging horses would sink. They used this knowledge to build something new. These weren't simple trenches. They were precisely engineered traps, each one roughly 5 feet deep, wide enough to completely trap a horse's leg. Positioned along the charge routes the cavalry would naturally follow, concentrated where the swamp would force them into tight formation. The crucial part, disguise. The Flemish covered every ditch with branches, grass, and local plants. From any distance, the field looked normal, empty, safe, perfect for a cavalry charge. The French cavalry, confident and experienced, saw what they expected. Open ground perfect for their style of fighting. They had no way to know the entire field was weaponized. Here's the key vulnerability. A warhorse can jump obstacles when it sees them coming, but it can't react to what it can't see. Charging at full speed, a horse depends entirely on seeing the ground ahead. When that ground vanishes without warning, there's no time to react. Physics takes over completely. For the armored French knights, this meant complete catastrophe. A knight in full armor doesn't just get up after being thrown at high speed. That armor, his protection on horseback, becomes a trap. Metal that heavy makes standing impossible. The helmet vision slits destroy his sense of direction when he hits ground. The agility he had on horseback evaporates the moment he's on foot. The French had perfected the shock cavalry formation. Packed tight, massive momentum, concentrated power. But when the front line disintegrated, that formation became a death trap. The rear couldn't maneuver, couldn't dodge, couldn't stop. The force that should have destroyed the Flemish became a weapon against itself. The Flemish peasants had figured this out. They'd studied how French cavalry attacked. They knew the cavalry wouldn't scout ground that looked obviously open. They knew French pride would make them charge straight in against mere peasants. Local knowledge was everything. The Flemish owned this territory. They knew where the ground held infantry, but rejected charging horses. They knew where to dig pits to funnel cavalry into killing zones. They knew which plants would hide their work best. The French had no such advantage. Every Flemish field looked the same to them. No reason to suspect the ground itself was weaponized. Then comes the final piece: positioning. When the cavalry collapsed into the ditches, the Flemish were perfectly placed. Not panicking, waiting, ready for the next phase. The ditches didn't need to win alone. They just needed to stop the cavalry long enough for the peasants to attack. And that is exactly what happened. Elite French knights moments ago unstoppable were pinned to the ground. Armor protected them from arrows, but not from close-range clubs while they were helpless. The armor actually made them vulnerable. Easy targets, slow, defenseless. The Flemish rushed the fallen knights like a flood. Godendog's brutal clubs with metal spikes crushed armor. Spears found gaps between metal plates. Peasant weapons that couldn't touch mounted cavalry became devastating against men on the ground. In minutes, everything reversed. The peasants had been the prey facing elite killers. Now, the killers were helpless, surrounded by their former prey. The knights tried to stand, tried to draw weapons, tried to regroup, but the armor that proved their superiority betrayed them. Every movement sluggish, desperate. The Flemish showed no mercy, no breaks, no pity. This wasn't just a battle, it was revolution. Years of brutal taxes, years of being humiliated by aristocrats, years of watching France grind their independence to dust. All of that fueled every strike. The Flemish weren't just tactical. They were fighting for justice, for dignity, for proof that birthright doesn't determine who can fight. And they were destroying them. French command dissolved. Generals tried to regroup, tried to save their remaining men, tried to stop the collapse. But how do you control cavalry when the formation disintegrates? Everything they depended on, formation, coordination, momentum, was gone. What was left? Individual knights fighting for their lives against a furious mob that outnumbered them. The numbers were staggering. About 1,000 French knights died dead. More than 60 were high-ranking nobles, including the commander Robert II of Artois. France's military elite, the force that had won every major war for centuries, was slaughtered by weavers and farmers. Flemish casualties? Tiny by comparison. This was supposed to be impossible. Medieval military logic said elite cavalry crushes peasant infantry, always. The entire social system depended on it. Nobles trained their whole lives. Best weapons, best horses. They should have been untouchable against farmers with improvised weapons. But on July 11th, 1302, that assumption died. Peasants proved that tactics beat privilege. Preparation beats equipment. Local knowledge and will beat training and tradition. The battle gave Flanders military victory, but it gave them something bigger. Proof. Proof that their oppressors weren't invincible. And the symbol? The Flemish collected hundreds of golden spurs from the dead knights. Golden spurs, the symbol of aristocracy, of elite warfare, of noble superiority. Now they were trophies held by weavers, blacksmiths, and farmers. The battle got its name from those spurs, a declaration. French noble symbols, ripped from dead knights' feet, displayed in the Church of Our Lady as permanent proof that the system could be bled to death. But Courtrais' importance reached far beyond one field. Beyond casualty counts. Beyond Flemish independence. The tactics didn't stop with the victory. They spread. Military commanders across Europe studied the battle, reconsidered everything they thought they knew about medieval warfare. One tactical innovation: hidden ditches showed possibility. That organized peasants could fight elite cavalry. That terrain and preparation mattered more than birthright and armor. That the military foundation of feudalism had cracks. One battle, one July day, one field in Flanders, and centuries of military certainty shattered. But those ditches changed everything. Not just the battle, not just medieval warfare. When you prove the impossible can happen. When you show that power systems can be broken by planning and strategy, you don't just win. You change what people believe is possible. The victory was total. But as the Flemish celebrated across the blood-soaked field, something bigger was starting, something that would transform medieval warfare forever. The story spread across Europe like fire. Tavern talk, court conversations. One impossible truth shook everything. Peasants had beaten French cavalry, not by luck, not by divine intervention, through pure tactical brilliance. The damage to France was catastrophic. Centuries of military pride built on knightly dominance lay in ditches at Courtrai. 1,000 knights dead. Not in a siege, not in a long war. In hours. Their advantages proved worthless. The survivors limped back to Paris carrying not just wounds but humiliation. Europe's elite had lost to people they saw as animals. But Europe's military minds studied the reports with fascination. Courtrai wasn't just a Flemish win. It was a tactical revolution, and they got it. After Golden Spurs, something changed on European battlefields. Commanders who'd attacked without hesitation now paused, studied, looked for hidden threats. Battlefield scouting, once a minor task, became crucial strategy. Courtrai's lesson was brutal. What you can't see kills you faster than any sword. The revolution started with analyzing terrain. Before 1302, commanders focused on formations and timing. Terrain mattered, but as a backdrop, not a weapon. Courtrai changed that. Suddenly every battlefield was dangerous. Every open field could hide a trap. Commanders sent scouts to find every ditch, every depression, every possible hidden defense. This caution wasn't paranoia. It was wisdom bought in blood. Defensive tactics exploded. Hidden fortifications barely known before became standard military planning. Engineers learned to use the land as a fortress. Ditches, trenches, camouflaged pits once seen as basic labor, now recognized as real weapons. The Flemish proved you don't need stone walls, just shovels, time, and smart planning. But the biggest shift was rethinking infantry. For centuries, cavalry owned medieval warfare. Knights were elite military, social, economic. Foot soldiers, support, cannon fodder. Courtrai shattered that hierarchy. If peasants with clubs could destroy elite cavalry, infantry wasn't weak anymore. It was powerful, strategic, decisive, especially on favorable ground. Commanders experimented. Infantry formations improved. Polearms, spears, halberds, Gudendogs became strategic focus. Anti-cavalry tactics were studied and taught. Armies restructured. Infantry got serious training, real equipment, actual respect. Before 1302, unthinkable. After 1302, essential. And there was more. Local knowledge became a real strategic advantage. Before Courtrai, invaders relied on force and speed. After Courtrai, defending home ground mattered. The Flemish won because they owned their land. Every stream, every dip, every muddy spot. That knowledge was a weapon. The environment became a weapon itself, not a backdrop, but an active tool. Commanders asked, how do we turn the land into a weapon? Courtrai proved the environment, when understood properly, could neutralize any advantage. Numbers, technology, psychology. The land became a fighter. Most importantly, Courtrai validated asymmetric warfare. Smaller, weaker forces could win through preparation, tactics, and environmental advantage. Brains could beat brawn. Planning could beat power. This principle echoed through military history. Later battles proved it. Bannockburn in 1314, Robert the Bruce used marshes and preparation to crush a bigger English army, copied the Flemish playbook. Crécy in 1346, English archers with stakes slaughtered French cavalry, same model. Infantry using ground as a weapon. The lesson spread, applied, repeated across battlefields. Medieval military doctrine evolved. War manuals included terrain reconnaissance, field fortifications, anti-cavalry tactics. Knight training expanded from combat skills to strategic thinking about environmental advantage and preparation. Trench warfare, which would define battlefields centuries later, started in Courtrai's ditches. The idea, victory through prepared defense, not brave charges. turn the land into a fortress. Let invisible manual labor defeat visible courage. All validated that July day in 1302. Courtrai became the textbook case. Military academies taught it centuries later. The perfect example of how smart preparation and ground advantage beat overwhelming odds. The battle became timeless. Because Courtrai was never about Flemings versus French. It was about universal principles that still matter today. And those principles still matter today. First, smarts beat force. The French had better knights, better weapons, better training. The Flemish had better intelligence. That won. Throughout history, the smarter side wins, not always the stronger. Courtrai is the perfect example. Second, use what you have, not what you wish for. The Flemish didn't cry about lacking cavalry, didn't try to copy the French, used their real strengths of local knowledge, manual skills, home ground as weapons. How many wars are lost fighting weaknesses instead of exploiting strengths? Courtrai says, exploit what you have. Third, never underestimate your opponent. French arrogance killed thousands. Assuming peasants were harmless made them blind. In war, business, sports, dismissing your opponent because they look weak, fight different, or have fewer resources is a death wish. Fourth, preparation wins wars. The Flemish digging ditches for weeks wasn't glorious, wouldn't make songs, but that boring, hidden, manual work countless hours of digging bought victory. Preparation nobody watches decides the battles everybody remembers. Fifth, David beats Goliath for real. Courtrai shows how intelligence beats overwhelming odds. Not luck, not miracles. Through strategy, using environment wisely, and executing a solid plan. The weak beating the strong through smarts is real. Courtrai proves it perfectly. These principles explain why Courtrai still matters 700 years later. Weapons change. Technology transforms. Specific tactics become outdated, but these core ideas never do. Intelligence, environmental advantage, preparation, respect for opposition, creative thinking about asymmetric power, timeless lessons. Courtrai teaches all of them. The battle stayed in cultural memory, unlike most medieval fights. The golden spurs hung in the church of Our Lady, proof the impossible happened. For centuries, locals showed them off, told stories of ancestors beating Europe's superpower. It wasn't just local pride. Military historians, tacticians, academics all kept studying Courtrai as the perfect example of unlikely victory. The battle became a lesson, a metaphor, an inspiration. The core lesson? Still clear after 700 years. The side that thinks smarter about advantage, that prepares better, that uses creativity instead of force, that turns weaknesses into strengths, that weaponizes the ground, that side wins, not always, not easily, but more often than the powerful expect. The Flemish 1302 proved it so thoroughly the echo still rings. Every smaller force beating a bigger opponent through smart preparation. Every defense that stops a confident attack. Every time local advantage beats invading power. Every time ground becomes a weapon. Courtrai echoes through time, reminding us the best weapon isn't always the sharpest. Sometimes it's the shovel, the tool that digs the ditch nobody sees, until it's too late. July 11th, 1302. A few hundred Flemish farmers with shovels proved. The smartest weapon isn't always sharp, it's what your enemy doesn't see. Loved this? Check out Agincourt, where English archers turned another impossible field into French cavalry graveyard. It's Courtrai 2-0. Think underdogs outsmarting empires is your kind of story? Like this. It tells us you want more battles where brains beat brawn. Subscribe for more examples of small forces turning land into weapons throughout history. In the comments, what other impossible battle should we cover? Where else do you see the Courtrai pattern hidden preparation leading to shock victory? Because every time someone gets overconfident, every time raw power assumes automatic victory, every time arrogance blinds leaders to danger, Courtrai's lesson returns, and 700 years of history prove it's a lesson worth learning.